So again, as I was saying, an appropriation bill here has to stick to appropriations, cannot have legal changes. And so that means there's kind of a strict kind of what can be in an appropriation bill and then what can't. So we can set the amount of money a program receives, even if there's a statutory formula. The great example of that right now is the dividend, the permanent fund dividend. We had a court case about that a few years ago. There's a formula in statute, but the legislature does not have to follow that formula. However, we can't revise the formula in the budget. You'd have to have a substantive bill. That has to be two separate documents. We can provide funding for capital projects. We can approve and reject collective bargaining agreements that the executive branch enters into with unions. We can move money in or out of savings accounts, but we cannot revise statutory formulas. We can't revise collective bargaining contracts like a union contract. Like we can't say, hey, we wish that we had given a bigger raise to somebody than the executive branch negotiated. It's all or nothing for us. We can't change municipal responsibilities. We can't increase or reduce taxes in the budget. That takes a bill. And so the result is our budget bill is very confined to just appropriations. And in order to make bigger changes, we need to pass bills related to those things. So an example would be the K-12 formula. In the budget, there's a formula in statute that says 1.2 billion goes to school districts. The budget cannot change how much a district gets versus another district. That's in statute. Can't change how much municipalities are required to contribute. Can't change how much teachers are paid. That's collectively bargained by the districts. Some states, you'll see an agreement, there will be like an agreement that says, oh, we're passing the new appropriation bill that includes an increase to teacher salaries. In Alaska, that's not something our legislature can do. That's a power we've given to the school districts to bargain. What we can do is partially or fully fund the formula or provide additional money above the formula. So in the current year, the legislature fully funded the formula and then added an additional $57 million to be distributed in the same manner as the formula, because that's kind of the power that we have through an appropriation bill. There were bills to actually change the formula. They did not pass. So the next item here is, what do appropriation bills look like? So there's two general parts of an appropriation bill. There's the numbers section, which is basically just a list of names of places money goes, and then an amount. And then there's the language section. And so I mentioned earlier how appropriations are the building blocks of the budget. So in the appropriation bill, that appropriation is bolded, and that's the amount that's sort of the basic amount. Within that, there's allocations of funding for different purposes, but the most important thing is that bolded appropriation. And so the executive branch cannot move money between appropriations and have to use it for the specified purposes. So in this example, for example, here we have in Department of Fish and Game, we have commercial fisheries. They cannot move that funding from commercial fisheries. They can't use money that we appropriate for commercial fisheries to for sport fisheries, for example, is a different purpose. And a note on terminology: if you look at OMB reports and things in the executive branch, they have a different way of looking at the budget than we do. We call these appropriations because that's what they are in the bill. In the executive branch, they tend to refer to them as results delivery units, or RDUs, because they're thinking about it in the function of government. It means the same thing, but you may see that term in some OMB reports. And then we call allocations of funding within those appropriations just an allocation, because that's, again, what it is in the bill. They often call them components because from the management standpoint, they're components of the executive branch. So again, you'll kind of get these different terms. They mean the same thing. And there is a glossary on both OMB's website and our website that can help you with that. So here's an example of a numbers section. So the agency name is in there. There's sometimes this thing called wordage, which is things like carry forward language. There's a few columns that that say the general funds, the other funds, and then the total funding, the general funds, and then the other funds. and then the funding for each allocation. Section 1 of a operating budget is this, looks like this. Sections 2 and 3 lay out the fund sources behind those, just general funds and other categories. And I want to note what's not here, because there's a lot of stuff, this is really what's in the appropriation bill is surprisingly little compared to how much information we have about the budget. So it doesn't have line items. It doesn't say how much is going to go to personal services or commodities or contractual services or anything else. It doesn't have position counts, which we hear talked about a lot, about the legislature added or deleted positions. That's not in there. All of those items are in budget reports that both LFD and OMB create. They're not in the budget bill. And I think that's important because, we talk about them a lot in the budget process, but they are not legally binding. Those are backup that are helpful for understanding what the budget actually does, but the executive branch is able to add and delete positions at will and move items across line items at will as well. So the legislature doesn't directly control those things, although they are important to our understanding of the process. James Brooks asked about or mentioned that, sometimes we write appropriations where usually the title is it's this thing. Sometimes we write it as everything but this, or for example, the House version of the operating budget this last year had changed the name of the Medicaid appropriation to Medicaid except for abortions, and then had a separate appropriation with $0 for Medicaid for abortions, the intent to prevent spending on abortions. So that would be an example of where these appropriation names and structures can be used to try to direct spending, to make the title everything in the Medicaid program except for the one thing we don't want them to do. So great question, James, because that is often a very interesting thing when they do that. They did that with the Department of Law and to try to prevent spending on a certain case, and then most recently with the attempts to stop spending on abortion. So, looking at this, if you look, this kind of looking at an actual appropriation bill, I think is a great, is helpful sometimes because you can see what's actually in the bill, but it's not the best way to get information about what's in the budget because, it's kind of vague. It doesn't have the actual fund codes lined up with each allocation. It doesn't have the positions and line items. Those things are in our reports, and when we get in a little later, I'll show you how to read budget reports and where those are found. And those are generally the easier place to actually find information than the bill itself for the numbers section. So we also have the language sections. These are written by legislative legal. This is where we have more complex items. We have statewide items, as we call them, like debt service. They also have things like the moving money in and out of savings. They have the permanent fund dividend and other appropriations that are a little more complex. We can have estimates in the language section where we say, the amount needed to accomplish a purpose, which we estimate is $5 million is appropriated. The actual number may be different. We don't know. And using this language allows us to have a little more flexibility in that. We can also have more specificity. We can, instead of just saying, the general purpose of labor, we can say specifically, the amount to do a very specific thing and not another thing, because you just get more space in the language section. But of course, the language section takes up a lot more space, harder to write. So generally, that's reserved for the more complex appropriations. And we try to put most of the agency operations in the numbers section. And again, all of these are in our reports. The language section is where sometimes it can be useful to look at the actual bill sometimes, because the actual bill is going to show you that actual language. The transactions won't always show the actual language. So the appropriation bills are structured with the agency level at the highest level. I'm going to skip through this. This is more for the kind of legislators and subcommittee staff. So the highest level is the agency. The second is the appropriations, which again are kind of the building block. Allocations are specific purposes within those appropriations. And the budget structure is important because it's the mechanism we can use to control where funding can be spent. If the legislature wants the department to really focus on one item and not use it for another item within the same appropriation. We may separate things into two appropriations and so forth. So our budget is actually built mechanically through a series of transactions. We have a number of transaction types showing increments and decrements and fund source changes and that sort of thing to show those in our budget reports. So I'm going to actually skip this for now and show you the reports on our website rather than through here. But our budget reports and OMB's budget reports are a great tool to see what's actually in the budget and how things are changing. So skip it for now, but we will come back to it. Okay, so the appropriations process. So the governor's budget is due on December 15th, and the legislative session starts about a month later. So during that time, that month before the session starts, my division is analyzing the budget. We verify the numbers and that all they did everything technically correctly. That usually takes a few weeks, and then we submit our overview of the governor's budget on the first day of session. That has narrative about what's going on in each agency's, as well as the bigger picture. So, I think important timing here is that a lot of times people want to know what's in the budget right away when the governor submits it. On December 15th, the only resource is OMB's reports. Ledge Finance can't really verify that information right away. We have to do our own analysis. We often find errors or mistakes, or sometimes just disagreements about how to portray things. And so we don't really have our own budget reports for a while, and we can't really explain much of what's in the governor's budget right away. So if you have questions about what's in the governor's budget on December 15th, you have to call OMB. We really don't know much because we're still sorting through it. It takes us quite a while to get through all the details to make sure they've done everything right. So usually they submit an operating bill, a mental health budget bill. So that's kind of an interesting story of back in the 90s, we settled a lawsuit that said that we weren't adequately funding mental health and had to track it in a separate appropriations bill. So mental health purposes have their own appropriations bill that travels with the operating budget. The governor also submits a capital budget. And then there's also a supplemental bill in some years. The governor generally submits a supplemental bill. We generally put it into other items or into other bills. The last few years, the legislature has actually not even had a separate capital bill. We've had everything in the operating bill and mental health bills. So, whereas in the past, we may have had all four of these appropriations bills, the last, I think, 3 years now, we've just had the operating and mental health bills, no separate capital bills. So a lot of this, the governor still submits them, but we end up combining them at the end. So the legislature will go through our process with the operating budget. The House starts first, and then the Senate with the capital budget. The Senate starts first, and then it goes to the House. And then the final appropriation bills are signed and transmitted to the governor for veto or signature. So Alaska uses an incremental budgeting system. So each year's budget is built on the previous year's budget. Changes are always reflected to the previous year's budget. So we call them transactions. The executive branch calls them change records that explain the differences from one to another. We experimented with zero-based budgeting where you start from scratch every year. That's how we do the capital budget and how the mental health trust works. But our operating budget is not like that. So we tend to have this cycle that you see on the next page where basically the operating budget is just building on last year's each time. So we start with the governor's budget submission, go through our legislative process. We end up with the conference committee budget. So in all years but one, we've had the House and Senate disagree on the budget. They work it out in what's called a conference committee where they agree on a common budget between them. They pass that. We add in fiscal notes and the governor will veto items. That gets what's called the authorized budget. So that is all the things that are legally appropriated in the budget. The executive branch can make some technical changes to that. As I said, they have control over moving things around within appropriations or line items, positions. That's what's called gets to what's called management plan. Management plan is basically what the government is currently doing at any given time. So we're right now in fiscal year 2023. So FY 2023 management plan is what the state government is operating under right now. And it's basically what the governor or what the legislature passed with these vetoes and then technical changes that the executive branch can make. Then when we start into the next year's cycle, there's a number of things that happen to get last year's budget and turn it into the next year's budget. So first of all, we remove one-time items, make any automatic adjustments like union contracts. We get to what's called adjusted base, which the legislative finance division creates. What that is essentially last year's budget with anything automatic happening, so you get a clean starting point. And then we add on to that, or the governor then has his initiatives, which are his increments, his decrements, any policy changes he wants to make. And using the adjusted base as our starting point helps the legislature distinguish between what's a policy choice that the governor's making and what's just, oh, this was a one-time item and it's over because we said it was one time. So we try to separate out these automatic things, and then we get just the governor's initiatives, and that rolls into the next year's budget submission in December. Okay, and this would be a good time to pause for questions. If anybody has any, either raise your hand or use the chat and let me know. Okay, not seeing anything. So we'll move on to the fund groups. So as I said, appropriations require amounts, purposes, and then fund sources. So every appropriation has to come from somewhere. We have a couple hundred actual fund codes, but we break them up into 4 broad groups. So kind of going from the least restrictive to most, we have our general funds on the left and then our other funds on the right. So the least restrictive is unrestricted general funds in this top left. That's funding that we can use for any purpose. Designated general funds. So the Constitution says that we can't dedicate funds, but the legislature still will put things in statute that say, half of alcohol taxes are supposed to be used for purposes relating to alcoholism prevention. And so, that's not binding on future legislatures, but it is a designation that the previous legislature made. And so we track it, we show it as designated general funds, but the legislature is allowed to contradict those statutory guidelines, even though they may be there, because again, we're not allowed to dedicate funds. So all of these on the left are considered general funds. These are funds that the legislature can spend for any purpose at any time. On the right, we have funds that have more restrictions. So on the top are other state funds. These are funds where we have limited discretion. So that's things like the federal government says, or the federal constitution says that taxes on interstate commerce can only be used for certain things. So when we collect taxes on cruise ships or other interstate or international airports, interstate commerce, we have to abide by those federal restrictions. We can't use those funds for any purpose. We have to follow what the feds say. And so those go in that other fund category. That we also put things like duplicated funding, like interagency receipts in there, which duplicated funding essentially is just when if we counted it in reports, it'd be double counting, but we want to show it just for kind of, okay, how does that thing get funded? Oh, it's interagency receipts, but the actual source funds are elsewhere. And then the most restrictive is federal funds. So the federal government tends to put a lot of strings on any money they give us. Generally, they tell us precisely what we can and can't do with the money. And there's generally very little legislative discretion. There's a couple of exceptions to this, but almost always the federal government gives us very little latitude with their funds. So the fund groups are important, again, because of our discretion on the use of funds. So unrestricted general funds we can use for anything. Federal funds, very restricted. And so when we're looking at sort of our budget as a whole, a lot of times we in the Legislative Finance Division focus on just unrestricted general funds or just general funds as a whole. And the reason behind that is because, again, these are the things with the most latitude, and it's the thing that we can have a deficit in. Generally, we don't say we have a federal funds deficit. If we don't have the money, we don't do the activity. But if we have too little general funds total, then we have a statewide deficit, and then we have to figure out what to cut. So in terms of our kind of fiscal situation, generally, those ones on the left are the ones that most relate to our state budget deficit. The ones on the right do not. Again, there are exceptions to this, but that's the general. So if we look at our budget by fund group in FY23, the majority of our budget is made up of unrestricted general funds. The next largest category is federal. Other and DGF are quite a bit smaller, 6% each. So, you know, when we're looking at the budget and we look at just UGF, that's not just a small slice, that's the majority of our budget. But the federal is the other really large, significant chunk. Those other two are quite a bit smaller. In this part, real money versus receipt authority, probably less important for you than for subcommittees, but you know, when we appropriate unrestricted general funds to an agency, they can spend that money. It's real money. It's an actual dollar. If we give them other types of appropriations, a lot of times those are receipt authority that they can only collect if they get the revenue. So if we give them federal receipt authority, they have to actually get money from the federal government to spend it. They can't just fund the items using some other funds. They actually have to get that money from the feds. So sometimes people look at the budget and say, well, you know, we can cut all this this other funding and federal, and we'll have a much smaller budget. But it doesn't actually reduce the budget deficit because the agencies have to have the money to spend it. Okay, so the FY23 budget. On the left, we have UGF revenue. On the right, we have our expenditures. You notice they match. We have a constitutional mandate to balance our budget, so we do. So our largest source of revenue this year is petroleum revenue. In some of the years with lower oil prices, it was our POMV draw, which is our next largest in green. This year, that is our second largest source of revenue. Non-petroleum revenue is usually about $500 million a year. It doesn't vary a whole lot. This year, we also had a couple of sources of revenue that are essentially use of savings. One is drawing from a statutory budget reserve. Another is using federal funds for revenue replacement. But again, the largest source by far is this year's petroleum revenue, and then that POMV drop. On the right, you can see what we spent the money on. Largest thing was agency operations, those sort of everyday, day-to-day budget costs. Next largest was the PFD and energy relief check combined. That was about $2.1 billion, about half of what we spent on agency operations. The next items are the capital budget here in the dark green and statewide items. Again, statewide items are things like debt service and community assistance program that goes out to the municipalities, things like that. Capital budget was about $735 million this year. We had higher revenue, so we had a larger capital budget than previous years. We also this year had a projected surplus, although oil has gone down quite a bit since our last forecast. We'll see where that ends up. That surplus was going to go to forward fund K-12, so provide funding for K-12 for FY24. Again, that provision depended on the price of oil. So breaking down where does the money go in agency operations, this is again that $4.2 billion biggest chunk here. So our largest area where our money goes, where our UGF budget goes, is to our education agencies, both the Department of Education and the University of Alaska. So that's about 40% of our budget. 28% is our health agencies. Until recently, that was one agency, the Department of Health and Social Services. Now it's two. That's 28%. So combined, those are 68%. The next largest is our public protection agencies, corrections, public safety, Department of Law, Judiciary, and then I put in the Office of Public Advocacy and Public Defender's Office, which are both actually within the Department of Administration, but functionally are kind of part of that public protection bundle, and that's 20%. So if you add these three things together, 88% of our state budget goes to education, health, and public safety. That leaves 12% for everything else. So that's the natural resource agencies, that's about 4% of our budget, Department of Transportation, 3%, and then everything else from Department of Revenue and our department here, the legislature, Department of Labor. Everything else is 5%. So I think it's just important to get the scale here that 88% of our budget is going to these three functions. The rest of the budget is pretty small in comparison. So a lot of our focus in the legislature tends to be on these three main functions, although it does encompass quite a few agencies. And I think that, not to get into policy talk so much, that's part of why the legislature finds cutting the budget hard. When 88% of your budget is going to these three purposes, it's definitely difficult to trim away. It might be easier if we had, a lot of money going towards these other items as well. Okay, so now I'm going to go to our budget resources. This is in the slideshow, but I'm actually going to switch us to something else. So I'm going to, again, pause for questions if there are any while I switch gears. Okay, so the question was, do we do any independent looks at the revenue forecast? Yes, so actually right now of our team, two of us are former Department of Revenue economists. I was a non-petroleum economist. We have another employee who's a petroleum economist. So we tend to look at the revenue forecast and talk to them quite a bit about methodology and sort of whether we, any issues we might have with how they're doing things. We generally, when they make changes to their forecast methodology, they will have meetings with us beforehand to talk to us about that and make sure we're comfortable with it. Recently, they changed their forecasting methodology for oil to go from we used to have the seminar called the oil price forecasting session. Now they use the futures market, and they consulted us quite a bit in that as well. I think the biggest difference that we have with them is that we tend to focus less on a particular oil price and more on looking at how the budget performs under a range of prices. And I think sometimes the Department of Revenue, they're supposed to come up with one forecast, and they will end up looking at just at sort of one price. And we always want to emphasize, and their staff do too, but it's not always used that way, that really we don't know what the oil price is going to be, so you should look at it at how things will look at a range of prices. But yeah, James, that's a great question. We do look at the revenue forecast and often have suggestions for changes or methodological questions about how they did things. Another question was, when we talk about the deficit, we were talking about UGF, DGF. Yes, actually the deficit is specifically UGF only. All these other things are just basically receipt authority, or on the fiscal summary, the expenditures for DGF, other, and Fed automatically will equal their revenue. So you can only really have a deficit in UGF. If there's a shortfall in program receipts or in another DGF thing, that would just affect the program where we appropriated the money. It wouldn't be part of our main deficit. So when we're talking about the deficit, we're really just talking about the overall UGF deficit that could affect multiple departments. And when we look at the fiscal summary, I think we can maybe see that. So going on to budget resources, and again, if you have questions as I go, feel free to pause, and I will try to not just interrupt my train of thought to do it. So OMB's, we'll start with OMB's website, because on December 15th, that's all you have to look at. So we'll start at the proposed budget, because that's what we get, because that's what we'll get on December 15th. So before I do that, I'll answer James' other question. So do we publish a report about the revenue forecast? We do not typically publish a report about it. In our overview last year, we actually had a pretty lengthy discussion about forecasting methodology to explain, why revenue changed their forecast and, what the implications of that are. We don't typically really publish anything on the revenue forecast, although I often will touch on it in the overview or in my presentations to finance committees. We don't have any publication about it. So on December 15th, the governor will release his budget, and you'll see something like this page. This is the FY23 version, and there's a whole lot of information here. So there's the operating bill itself, there's a bunch of reports. So I'm going to kind of focus on what are some of the useful things to look at. The first thing I always look at is the fiscal summary. And this is essentially OMB's vision of how the budget stacks up and whether they have a deficit or not. In this case, they projected that the governor's budget had a $26.7 million surplus. And so this has the totals for how much they were going to spend on agency operations, statewide items, capital. And so I mentioned that we only have deficits in UGF, and you can kind of see the reason in how that looks on our fiscal summary. So on the fiscal summary, there's this restricted revenue line. Both our version and OMB's version of the fiscal summary have this. We just set that to equal appropriations for that type. So restricted revenue equals total appropriations, because again, a shortfall in those will just impact where they're appropriated, not generally. And so if there's any deficit, that only can come in that UGF line. And in this case, they said there was a surplus, so their surplus only came in that UGF line. And so the OMB fiscal summary is sort of the first look at it. We will publish our fiscal summary probably sometime in January. It usually has slightly different numbers because our analysis comes to slightly different conclusions. They often will revise their fiscal summary to match differences in ours, so they'll sort of converge over time. But their first version often ends up looking a little different from how they end up. So this fiscal summary is a great place to see just sort of the bigger picture of the budget. Is there a deficit? Is there an increase or decrease in agency operations? So the governor had a less than 1% increase in agency operations. Is the capital budget up or down? So you can see all of that kind of at a glance with the fiscal summary, and I think that's a great place to start. You also see the reserve balances. So they were projecting the end of FY23, 70 million in the SBR, 1.4 billion in the CBO. And obviously this was their December release last year, so this doesn't reflect what actually happened or, where we ended up. But this is an example of, I think, a really helpful starting point just to understand the big picture of what their budget's doing. If you want to drill down, they do have a series of reports that are on the summary level. And here's where I'll explain how reports work. So there's kind of two different main types of operating budget reports. There's summary or totals reports, and then there's transaction or change record reports. So these summary reports will be either by department or appropriation or allocation, and have these basically going across these different columns that are the amount of the budget at different points. So in this case, they're using FY21 actuals, so actual amount spent in FY21, the amount the legislature authorized in the conference committee, the authorized budget after vetoes, the FY22 management plan, and then FY23 governor. So each of these columns reflects a different version of the budget. Then they have one comparison, which is management plan to governor, to show how the governor changed the budget from there. So if you can, these reports are a great way to see, again, just those top level changes. In OMB's reports, it looks like they will tend to have just one comparison. We tend to have some more than that. But generally, these summary reports look very similar between ours and theirs. They also will have change record reports, so they don't put those on the main page. You have to go down by agency. So if you want to say, hey, I would like to know what major changes the governor made in the Department of Natural Resources, you go to the Department of Natural Resources page, and then they have the change record detail, and that shows all of the changes allocation by allocation. So all the transactions, and you can get into the detail. I think their reports are not as easy to read as ours. Obviously, I'm biased. I've worked here a lot longer than I worked at OMB, so I prefer our reports. But on December 15th, these are the reports you have, so that's what we have to deal with. On December 15th, we don't yet have the detail here. So eventually, usually early January, they publish these full budget books, and those show a lot of detail, but component by component. So if you want to really dig in, these are incredibly detailed and have all the information you could possibly want about the governor's budget. They have org charts, which I find really helpful to understand just what is in a division, what are the positions. And so those are, I think, their reports are fairly intuitive. I mentioned, but again, you have to kind of dig around to find those actual change records because they're under each agency. Two other things I want to highlight on the OMB website. So under information and reports, they have their 10-year plan. So the governor is required to submit his 10-year plan with his budget. And this shows, what the governor's long-term plan is, and they have to update this every year. I always go to the tables. I ignore the text because that's how I am. Some people like the text. And this shows how the governor is proposing to basically solve the fiscal situation for the next decade. This was subject of a lot of legislative discussion this last year, whether the governor's plan was realistic or not. And, this is sort of where that long-term vision is. And then, so to learn more about the OMB website, there's a file on this Teams document that OMB prepared that they asked me to share when I do trainings. That's a guide to OMB's website. It has some information about what's on their website and how to get to it and how the things work. Super helpful little guide to everything that's there. So we got a question about the break-even point. So I'll go to our website because that's a great chance to talk about some of the added things we have here. So one of our publications, this is the LFD website, likefin.akleg.gov, are newsletters, which we've only done 2 this year. We're averaging 2 a year, not great, but generally some pretty good information. So if we go back to the July newsletter, we had this little graphic that talks about how the FY23 budget works and what the break-even prices are. So basically, the FY23 budget that the legislature passed had several mechanisms to deal with oil price volatility. So in blue at the bottom, we just show the UJF revenue that goes to the basic budget. Purple is the fund transfers that we use to get there. And then at various prices, different things happen beyond that. So if prices are below what we had said based on the spring forecast was $87 a barrel, based on kind of the newer numbers that DOR has been talking about lately, where revenue's coming in a little higher, that may actually go down a little bit. Break-even price might turn out to be more like $85. But we'll see the forecast next week. But anything below that, we would have a deficit. The legislature did not have a vote to fill the budget deficit. We assumed that our budget was balanced. Obviously, prices have gone down. And so if prices are below that $87 point or 85 or whatever it ends up being, we would end up needing a CBR vote. The Constitutional Budget Reserve is our main savings account. Has over $1 billion in it, and it requires a 3/4 vote to access. So it's kind of difficult for the legislature to get in there, but if prices are below 87, we would need to get in there. If prices are between 87 and 102 a barrel, that marginal revenue we'd get in will go to K-12 forward funding. So if oil ends up at $90, then any revenue we get from oil being between that and 87 would go towards forward funding K-12. Beyond that, there's a little bit of a gap where we'd have a surplus. So anything between 102 and 111 would just be, and 109 would go into the CBR as a surplus. Anything above 109 would go into the permanent fund. We had an appropriation that said that all revenue over a certain amount would go into the permanent fund directly, and that the governor vetoed that to increase that threshold, but it's about $110 or $109 a barrel. Everything would go into the permanent fund. So I hope that's helpful and that answered your question. One other thing I'd say is that, these things in purple, this drawing from savings, doesn't really reflect a balanced budget. We still drew from savings, even if we're thinking we have a surplus. And so the true break-even point where our budget would balance without drawing from savings is actually more like $94 a barrel. Certainly a lot higher than we're expecting, but because, although we were expecting 101 when we left town in May, but that would be our true break even where we don't need to rely on savings, although we did have some savings draws to get there in the regular budget process. Another question James asked was, have you seen a governor actually follow their 10-year plan? Well, the governor doesn't get to make the appropriations, the legislature does. So even if the governor tried to, we have a say in the process. But generally, 10-year plans are kind of aspirational. They show what we could do if the revenue forecast comes true. We know it won't really. And a level of growth that they may aspire to. So this 10-year plan that they introduced last year had a 1% growth rate for agency operations. In reality, this year, we grew the budget by about 7%. So, whether we can stick to that or not is questionable, but it's at least a conversation starter. Maybe it's not something that gets actually followed at the end of the day once the legislature and, actual prices, oil prices get through. But it's an interesting document anyway to understand the governor's thinking. And so, going back to our newsletters briefly, if you want to sign up, there's a subscribe to our mailing list. We probably will have one right before session, I hope. And we use these as just a chance to inform the legislature and the public about the impact of things that have happened recently. So, for example, when the actual permanent fund revenue earnings came in for FY22, we compared, what does that mean? It means that they had a bad year. It means that we have less revenue than anticipated, but still didn't undo the gains from FY21. So it's kind of our chance to get some information out there during interim. Recommend you all sign up if you want to kind of get some information as we go. And I think people have probably seen this graphic from the July one because it's been circulated a bit. But, we try to explain things like what we actually did and how it works in the newsletters. So once we're done with our analysis of the governor's budget in, sometime in January, we will post our own version of reports. So on our website, there's tabs for operating, capital, and supplemental and current reports. You can see here we have this huge sort of timeline of the entire legislative process, and we post a round of reports each time that happens. So at the beginning of the year, we start with just governor only. And we have similar reports to OMB. We have these summary reports. This should look similar to the one from OMB that I showed you earlier. And then we have agency by agency reports. They include a number of ways to look at the change records or transactions. You can do one that just shows the governor's policy initiatives, this first one that does the same thing, but then has, the full description. So this is OMB's submitted description of what they're doing with every item. That's the transaction change notes. And then a transaction change detail. That transaction change detail looks a lot like OMB's reports, where it goes allocation by allocation and has all the differences. So these allocation summaries are kind of where you'd see, how would you, that question I just got about how would you see how much money goes to various parts. So if you look at a UGF allocation summary, I'll use Fish and Game as the example. Oops, Fish and Game. And you can see by each allocation and appropriation in bold where the funding is going in various versions of the budget. So similar to the ones on OMBs, we have 21 actuals, management plan, adjusted base, and governor, as well as supplementals. And so you can see on there, how much money the governor is putting towards these various purposes, and how that compares to last year in these comparisons on the right. These column titles can be a little vague, I would say, to people who are not used to budget lingo. The last page of our reports always has column definitions, which is as much as we can do, a plain English version of what each of these versions of the budget means. And so these allocation summaries are a great way to see how much money is going to each purpose. The transactions can tell you basically how we get there, through increments and decrements or fund changes, and then the ones with notes will tell you the details about the reasoning behind that the executive branch is submitting. So these reports are a great place to start to get the basic information. Another place that I think is really helpful once they're ready in session is our publications. So the overview of the governor's budget. This is our annual publication. You can see 245 pages. We're getting pretty lengthy. And this has, kind of our intro, which is looking at, kind of a narrative discussion of what the fiscal situation is and some graphics. We have a detailed line-by-line walkthrough of the language section of the governor's budget. So, this is probably not super useful for the general public, but for the co-chairs who are actually writing the budget, we actually go through line by line the entire language section and explain what the sections do, and we include our commentary about any changes and some context behind that. So if you ever want to know, hey, why is this in the budget? What does this mean? That's in our kind of detailed walkthrough. And then we also have these agency narratives, and I think these are another really helpful place. Those transaction reports, I think, can be a little hard to read sometimes, maybe too technical. So we also have these narratives where we talk about the significant budget changes in each agency. So for education, we talk about, here's the amount of the K-12 formula and how it's changed from the previous year. Here are some increments that the governor's proposing. Here are fund changes. And again, we're explaining why and then having commentary that provides more context on those items. So if you're trying to understand what's going on in the governor's budget and why, this is a great place to go. But again, that's what we're working on throughout the second half of December and first half of January. So these aren't available until the beginning of session. After session, we have kind of the similar version, the conference committee books. These show what we did. So similarly, we'll have one for each agency. It has narrative that will explain, what the governor proposed and then what we enacted, what it means, what all the changes were. So I think these can be really helpful if you're trying to understand, what actually happened in the budget after the fact. But again, these aren't going to be available the day after the budget passes. We need time to write them. So, sometimes for journalists, the timeline doesn't quite work for you guys to use these for your stories. But again, I think they are really useful context. Another thing on here I wanted to point to was our publications. So on our publications page, we have these budget history data and graphs. So this budget history data is a comprehensive spreadsheet of back to statehood funding, revenue and funds by fund group, and also adjust those for inflation and per capita. And then we have a series of graphs that we make out of those that I think are kind of helpful and can be a starting point. If you're ever working on something that requires looking at how much did we actually spend in the 1960s, this is your place to get that. If you want to learn more about the budget process, we have this budget handbook that's also called the Swiss Army knife, that will tell you about more detail about the budget process than what I went through in this hour. We have a series of informational papers that go through certain issues. So we have like frequently asked questions about Medicaid. We have a guide to the K-12 formula in there that I think tend to be useful to people who are trying to learn about those programs. And then we have information about every single fund that we use and a description of that. Again, there's kind of a fire hose of information. There's probably more than most people would use, but sometimes it can be situationally useful. Then one other like little hidden thing I want to show, I didn't show any capital reports, but if you look at capital reports, project detail, if you click on the project name, it takes you to the backup that we have for that capital project with more description. So if you want to know more about any capital project in the budget and go to these reports, you can click on this and get to the backup that gives that information. So we try to put all this out there, but obviously there's just a ton of information. And so, if you're looking for something, chances are that the information you're looking for is on either our website or OMB's website somewhere. But again, there can be a fire hose. Feel free to call us. We can help direct you to the right resources. But the timing is important. Again, we don't have our reports and our analysis up the day after the governor's budget comes out. That takes us a month or so to get through all of that. I think I'm kind of out of my allotted time here, so I'm gonna open it up for questions again. Probably just let people unmute at this point. So if anybody wants to unmute and ask. Okay, you should be able to unmute yourself now. So happy to answer any other questions. And again, I'll send the slides around so you have those, but they're also a file under this document. So any other questions? I know I went through a ton of information in an hour, so probably just fire hose.
Hey, Alexei, it's James Brooks.
Yeah, James.
I didn't quite follow on your answer to Yareth's question where you had said like something about the true break-even point. I didn't quite follow what you were saying there.
Yeah, so this kind of gets back to a debate that my division has had with the Office of Management and Budget over the last few years. When we're looking at our fiscal summary, and I'm just going to pull that up. So in our fiscal summary, there's two deficits. Line 17, there's the pre-transfer surplus deficit. And that's basically before we move money around in and out of savings accounts, what's our just operating budget surplus or deficit. And then after we move money around, there's our post-transfer deficit. And OMB the last few years, their fiscal summary puts fund transfers up in revenue or expenditures if they're positive or negative. And so they don't report a pre-transfer deficit. They only show a post-transfer deficit or surplus in this case. And why we think that's important to Ledge Finance is, when you're talking about like, when do we balance the budget? Like your personal budget, what does it balance? You don't want to say, well, I drew $200 from savings, and after that, I had $100 left over, so I ran a $100 surplus this month. That wouldn't be how I would think of my personal budget. I would think, well, before I had to draw from savings, what was my deficit? And that might be, well, I had a deficit of $100, but I had enough in savings to cover that. And so that's where that pre-transfer number comes in. And that break-even price in FY23 is $94. All these 87 versus 101 for K-12 forward funding, really those apply to the post-transfer deficit numbers. So if we're looking at our true fiscal situation, rather than just, when is K-12 funded versus when do we have to have a CBR vote, that's what happens at $94 is the true fiscal balancing point. So I hope that's helpful. Why we have three budget balancing points this year. Usually we just have two, but making it even harder this year. So the question was, can the budget handbook be downloaded or reorder print copies? So you can download it. There are print copies available in the legislative print shop. I don't know for people who are not Capitol reporters if they're allowed to take those or not. That's a question I've never encountered. I know they have them at the Anchorage LIO too, but you can also just download it from there. Yeah, I don't know if people can just take those from the print shop if they're not legislative employees or in the building, but they have them at both the LIO in Anchorage and in the Capitol. So that's a great question that I should probably ask the print shop about.